I should have known something was wrong when he couldn't look me in the eye during our first dance, but I blamed the champagne instead. That's what you do, isn't it? When you're desperate to believe in something. You make excuses, fill in the gaps with whatever story makes the pain go away. Tell yourself you're imagining things, because admitting the truth would mean accepting that everything you've built is crumbling beneath your feet. Our wedding day was perfect on paper, exactly the sort of thing you'd see in a magazine spread or on someone's carefully curated Instagram feed, and I'd spend 18 months planning every detail down to the napkin rings. I'd agonized over color schemes and seating charts, sampled 14 different caterers, had 3 dress fittings where I cried because it felt so surreal that this was actually happening. And Matt seemed happy enough, or at least that's what I told myself when he'd zone out during cake tastings or forget to confirm with the photographer. He was just stressed about work, I reasoned, or overwhelmed by all the decisions, because men don't care about these things the way women do, right? That's what everyone kept saying anyway. My mum, his mum, my married friends who'd been through it all before. They all assured me that grooms are naturally less invested in the details, that it didn't mean anything, that he'd be absolutely buzzing on the actual day. Except he wasn't. I mean, he smiled in all the right places, said his vows without stumbling, kissed me when the registrar pronounced us husband and wife, but there was something hollow about it all, like he was going through the motions of a play he'd rehearsed but didn't particularly want to perform. During the reception, whilst I was flitting about talking to guests and feeling like I was floating on air despite my feet screaming in those ridiculous heels, I kept catching glimpses of him standing alone near the bar, staring at his phone with this expression I couldn't quite read. Not happy, not sad, just absent. When I finally made my way over to him, weaving through my great-aunt Linda, who wanted to tell me about her hip replacement, and my cousin's girlfriend, who I'd never met before, he quickly shoved his phone in his pocket and gave me this bright, performative smile that didn't reach his eyes. I asked if he was all right, and he said he was perfect, absolutely perfect, just needed a breather from all the attention. And I believed him because I wanted to. Because on your wedding day, you're not supposed to interrogate your husband about why he seems disconnected. You're supposed to be deliriously happy and trust that any weirdness is just nerves or exhaustion or too much champagne. The honeymoon was worse. We'd saved for ages to afford 2 weeks in Greece, this beautiful resort on Santorini that I'd been dreaming about since I was a teenager watching travel shows on telly. I'd imagined us having lazy breakfasts overlooking the caldera, exploring little villages hand in hand, making love with the windows open and the Mediterranean breeze drifting through the room. Instead, Matt spent most of his time on his laptop, claiming he needed to catch up on work emails because he'd taken too much time off and his boss was getting antsy. I'd suggest we go for a walk, and he'd say maybe later. I'd want to have a proper conversation over dinner, and he'd be distracted, checking his phone between courses, giving me half-formed answers that made it clear he wasn't really listening. On the 4th night, I finally lost it a bit. Not shouting or anything dramatic, just this quiet, desperate plea for him to tell me what was wrong, because clearly something was wrong, and I needed to know if it was me, or the wedding, or work, or what. He got defensive immediately, said I was being paranoid and needy, that I was ruining the honeymoon by creating problems where there weren't any. I apologized. Can you believe that? I actually apologized for noticing my husband of less than a week couldn't stand to be present with me. When we got back home, I tried to convince myself that things would settle once we returned to normal life, that the weirdness had just been wedding stress and travel exhaustion and the pressure of this big life transition. We moved into the flat we'd bought together 6 months earlier, started our routines as a married couple, and for a while I almost managed to pretend everything was fine. Matt went to work, I went to work, we'd have dinner together most nights, watch telly, go to bed. It was fine. Except it wasn't, not really, because there was this distance between us that hadn't been there before, or maybe it had always been there and I'd just been too busy planning a wedding to notice.
He stopped initiating sex. I'd try to be affectionate and he'd tolerate it but not reciprocate, like I was a clingy pet he was humoring. We stopped talking about anything meaningful. Our conversations became transactional, functional, revolving around whose turn it was to do the shopping, or whether we needed to call a plumber about the dodgy shower. I felt like I was living with a flatmate who was vaguely annoyed by my presence, rather than a husband who'd chosen to spend his life with me. About 2 months after the wedding, I came home early from work because I'd felt sick all morning and my boss had sent me home. I walked into our bedroom to find Matt on his phone, and the look on his face when he saw me was pure panic. He locked the screen immediately, but not before I caught a glimpse of a name I didn't recognize. When I asked who he was talking to, he said it was no one, just a colleague, nothing important. I didn't push it because I was knackered and felt like death and didn't have the energy for a row, but that moment stuck with me, nagging at the back of my mind like a splinter I couldn't quite reach. I started paying more attention after that, noticing little things that individually meant nothing, but collectively painted a picture I didn't want to see. He was suddenly very protective of his phone, taking it everywhere, including the bathroom. He'd started staying late at work more often, sometimes not coming home until after 10. He'd mentioned names I'd never heard before, colleagues and clients, and people from the gym he'd apparently just joined, except he never suggested I come along or meet any of these people. When I'd ask about his day, he'd give me these vague, unsatisfying answers that shut down any further conversation. The worst part was how he made me feel like I was losing my mind. Every time I'd bring up my concerns, he'd tell me I was being paranoid, that marriage was making me needy and jealous, that I was smothering him and he needed space to breathe. He'd turn it around on me, make it about my insecurities and trust issues, until I genuinely started to believe that I was the problem. Maybe I was too clingy, maybe I was being unreasonable, maybe this was just what marriage was like once the honeymoon phase wore off. All my married friends seemed happy enough, and they'd probably gone through the same adjustment period, right? I started seeing a therapist to work on my anxiety and attachment issues, convinced that if I could just fix myself, our marriage would improve. It took 6 months before I found the proof I'd been unconsciously looking for, but desperately hoping I wouldn't find. Matt had left his laptop open on the kitchen table whilst he was in the shower, and I wasn't snooping, I genuinely wasn't. I just sat down with my cup of tea and glanced at the screen. WhatsApp was open, messages with someone called Sophie. I should have closed the laptop and walked away, should have respected his privacy and trusted that there was an innocent explanation, but I couldn't. I scrolled up, my hands shaking, my heart hammering against my chest like it was trying to escape my chest. The shower turned off. I heard Matt moving about in the bathroom. I closed the laptop carefully, picked up my phone, took photos of my photos of the most damning messages using my phone, and then I just waited. When he came out, hair still damp, wearing those trouser pants I'd bought him for Christmas, I asked him very calmly who Sophie was. I watched the colour drain from his face. I watched him open his mouth and close it again like a fish gasping for air. I watched him formulate a lie, saw him realize it was pointless, and watched him deflate. He sat down at the table and started crying, which almost made me laugh, because what right did he have to cry when I was the one who'd been living a lie for months? He said he was sorry, that he'd never meant it to happen, that Sophie was someone he'd met at his new job, and they'd just clicked in a way that terrified him. He said he'd tried to end it before the wedding but couldn't, said he'd gone through with marrying me because he thought it would force him to let her go, because he loved me and wanted to do the right thing, and believed he could make it work if he just tried hard enough. He said he'd been torturing himself trying to figure out how to fix this mess he'd created, and every time he looked at me, he felt consumed with guilt, but also trapped, because he couldn't imagine his life without Sophie. I asked him if he wanted a divorce, and he said he didn't know, that he was confused and overwhelmed and didn't know what he wanted. I told him that wasn't good enough, that I deserved better than being someone's backup plan, and if he couldn't commit to our marriage properly, then he needed to leave. He cried more, said he didn't want to lose me, begged for time to figure things out. I gave him until the end of the week. He moved out 3 days later. He'd tried to have his cake and eat it too, attempted to maintain contact with both of us, but Sophie had apparently given him an ultimatum, and he'd chosen her. I found out later from a mutual friend that they're living together now, that he seems happy in a way he never was with me, and that hurts more than I can properly articulate, not because I want him back, I genuinely don't, but because it confirms that everything I felt during those final months of our relationship was real. I wasn't being paranoid or needy or insecure. I was noticing the truth he was trying desperately to hide, picking up on the absence of love he was attempting to disguise with obligation and guilt. I'm doing all right now, mostly. Some days are harder than others. I've moved to a smaller flat that's just mine, redecorated it exactly how I want, without having to compromise or consider anyone else's preferences. I've reconnected with friends I'd neglected during the relationship,